YouTube? Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. Mr. Terry, as I continue my search for historical knowledge found here on YouTube. All right, we're heading back to the Epic History TV World War I series. So what they've done here is done a video on each year of the war thus far. So we did 1914, we did 1915, and today we're looking at 1916. So we're kind of right in will end up being the middle of the war and some of the most brutal times. So I'm excited to get back into that. If you wanted to see it, the 1915, 1914, check those out. You can come back and join us here. The original video link is down below. Make sure you support Epic History TV, who are awesome and kind, and do awesome content right there. All right, and with that, let's go ahead and get started.
World War I was supposed to have been a short and glorious war.
So people thought originally.
But by 1916, a new kind of industrialized warfare had seen the death toll soar into the millions, with no end in sight.
You gotta remember, this is the first conflict anywhere near this size of the post-Second Industrial Revolution, which means mechanization, factory output, all that stuff can now be weaponized, which was able to arm people and made weapons more destructive. And again, importantly, mass-produced, which is why, yeah, this war ends up being so deadly, and also a reason it was so long as well, because so many countries were industrialized by now.
Naval blockades were beginning to cause shortages of food and fuel across Europe, while thousands of women had entered the workforce, replacing the men sent to fight in their millions.
There's a term called total war that they talked about earlier in the series, where the entire nation's resources are mobilized, I guess you could say, to the war effort, and you see in a total war more civilians have to get involved because of how big the war effort actually is. And in this case, in a lot of countries with so many men going to, you know, fight in the war or start training, women were the ones, like you see in here, making artillery, learning how to do heavy machinery type jobs, things that weren't really ladylike, you know, customarily before that. That's all changing.
All sides were preparing for a long war.
Or attrition, just kill, wear down their numbers.
The war has raged for a year and a half as the Allies continue to battle the Central Powers, recently joined by Bulgaria. At sea, the British maintain their naval blockade of Germany, preventing the import of food and other vital raw materials. Germany has retaliated with a U-boat blockade of Britain, but has to limit its attacks to avoid provoking the neutral USA, whose citizens have already been caught in the crossfire.
That's already so difficult for if you think of the Germans, how they have to handle that, because they obviously don't want Britain getting supplies, especially war supplies, or really any economic sports, but especially war supplies and stuff, from somewhere like the United States, which was doing that, making a fortune off of selling this stuff. So it was hard. Germany was put in a tough position because, like, what do? It's like you don't want Britain to get this stuff, but you don't want to provoke the Americans, so what do you do?
On the Western Front, French, British and Belgian troops are dug in opposite the Germans, both sides trapped in the bloody stalemate of trench warfare. On the Eastern Front, the Russians have ended their long retreat and stabilized the line, but their army has suffered huge losses.
Think how demoralizing it would be to be somebody, if you were fortunate to live this long, like you had started in the war in 1914, it's 1916, and you've been doing this trench warfare, and it's again a full year and a half, 2 years, and you've made virtually no progress. I mean, the pessimism must have been just huge. And you think you'd get to the point where you really don't care about winning. You want to be done. You just want to go home because you don't see anything positive that can happen from this. I mean, that was the sentiment. You can read journals and stuff where they didn't care anymore. It's like, we just want to be done. This war is never going to end.
On the Italian
Can't even
front,
imagine it.
Italian troops have launched a series of costly, unsuccessful attacks against strong Austro-Hungarian defences.
Wearing an Italian shirt today.
While on the Balkan front, the Central Powers have overrun Serbia, whose army is forced to make a bitter retreat through the Albanian mountains.
They talked about in earlier videos how Serbia did really well at the beginning of the war, especially when it was only Austria that had attacked them. They were able to hold off at least most of their country. But then once you had like Bulgaria or the Ottoman Empire coming and surrounded them, little Serbia was a little bit too much for them at that time. But
now,
man,
on the 5th of January, Austro-Hungarian troops attack Montenegro. They are delayed at the Battle of Mojkovac, but 3 weeks later, Montenegro is forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, the Russians launch a surprise winter offensive against Ottoman Turkish forces. 6 weeks later, Russian troops occupy the city of Erzurum. In April, they capture the Black Sea port of Trebizond.
Remember, the Ottoman Empire and Russia have been rivals for now a good couple centuries, especially over Black Sea territory, Caspian Sea territory, and during the Industrial Revolution too, in this era when oil becomes important, these regions became especially important for that.
Meanwhile, the British transport 2 motorboats to Lake Tanganyika in Africa. They finally arrive after a 10,000-mile trip by sea and land.
Jeez.
And help the British seize control of the strategic lake from local German forces.
It's a long way to go for a battle.
The same month, in German Cameroon, German troops besieged on Mora Mountain for 18 months finally surrender to the Allies. It marks the end of the Cameroon campaign.
They shall not pass. Verdun. Offensive
on
time.
the Western Front, the Germans unleash a devastating assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn knows France will defend this symbolic town to the last man.
Yep.
His plan, in his own words, is to bleed France white in its defense. It is the strategy of attrition. Verdun becomes one of the most terrifying battles of the war, a mincing machine.
Yeah, war of attrition is really just kill as many people as possible. It is because there's usually more to it than that. Just not just kill. There's more timing and more geography involved and places you have to take, more strategy and that kind of thing. War of attrition again is winning equals killing more than the other people, which isn't always the case in a war. Just because you kill more people or die more doesn't mean you're going to win or lose. There's more to it. But war of attrition, yeah, that's specifically what that is. Just bleed them dry. Because you'd think, on both sides of the war, they're at the point where it's like, how can these nations still have reserves coming in, right? Like, you have to run out eventually.
Where infantry divisions are destroyed almost as fast as they can be fed into the line. In Britain, 1 million men have already volunteered for military service. But the government realizes it won't be enough. Britain becomes the last major power to introduce conscription.
Yeah, most everybody did conscription right away, meaning it's the draft. And interesting how the British waited so long, and I'd like to know more about that, if they just thought it wasn't necessary or it would be unpopular. You know what I mean? I'd like to get some more resource on that, because the United States declared war and very quickly went right to the draft, and Germany had been drafting, and France, and those countries might seem a little more desperate, But yeah, Britain, waiting so long, real interesting. I need to look more into that.
That spring, on the Western Front, British troops are the last to be issued with steel helmets. The nature of trench warfare produces a high proportion of head wounds. The German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I steel helmet.
Is that just because your head is near the trench, the trench line, and that's why it's, so much more? I guess that makes sense.
Offer limited protection from shell splinters and shrapnel.
Yeah, because it's constantly head
Neutral
level.
Portugal has been cooperating with the British, which seems to offer the best chance of holding on to her African colony, Portuguese Angola. On the 9th of March, Germany retaliates by declaring war on Portugal.
Who's been out right here?
On the Eastern Front, Russia launches an attack near Lake Narok to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. But it's a disaster. There are 100,000 Russian casualties, and the attack fails to divert any German troops from the fighting at Verdun.
5-1.
In Dublin, Irish Republicans launch an armed revolt against British rule. It becomes known as the Easter Rising, and is put down after 6 days of street fighting.
Definitely hard. Something that the British government would have to try to control is this sort of thing while trying to fight. Now they where do you allocate things like that? So, Arab Revolt. T. Lawrence.
In the Middle East, after a 5-month siege, British forces at Kut surrender.
Something you got to understand is the Arab community's distrust and dislike of being ruled by the Ottoman Empire. They don't like that, and you would think maybe that wouldn't be that harsh, but it was. They didn't like that. They wanted to be independent. So I know they'll probably set this up, but the British were very aware of that, and the Allies are very aware of that not everybody in the empire is necessarily supportive of the Ottoman government. So smart thing to do, find people within a nation that you were fighting that and help them to revolt and help them to kind of create fighting from within. But yeah, there's a long history of that. The Arab world, especially this time. I mean, the Ottoman Empire is not what it used to be. It's not even close to what it used to be. It's a shell of its former self. It used to go, over there into and west into Britain. It was east, more into Persian territory and stuff. Actually, not as much into where Persia would be, but more, a lot of more control in the Mesopotamian area. But yeah, through the Arabian Peninsula, but had been losing some of that.
General Townsend leads 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity. About half later die from starvation or disease.
Jeez.
Britain wants Arab support in its fight against the Ottoman Empire, so it's promised Arab leaders an independent Arab state after the war.
Spoiler alert, doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. And they feel betrayed.
But now, Britain and France secretly sign the Sykes-Picot Agreement, planning after the war to divide the Middle East into British and French zones of control.
That's going to be I don't want to talk too much about it, but that is going to be an absolute mess for Middle Eastern politics from the end of the war to the current day. It's a mess.
Hussein bin Ali, Sharif of Mecca, leads the Arabs in revolt against Turkish Ottoman rule. In the Battle of Mecca, his forces seize control of the Holy City.
Holy City, right?
Italian
Holy City of Islam.
Austro-Hungarian forces launch a surprise attack at Asiago. Italian defences give way. Austro-Hungarian troops are poised to break through into northern Italy. That month in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet clashes with the British Grand Fleet at the Battle of Jutland. In the only major naval battle of the war, the British suffer heavier losses, but claim victory as the German fleet withdraws and does not re-emerge from its base for the rest of the war.
Someone's got to make a push. I mean, you're in 1916, you don't see it in sight. You got to make a push, but again, how do you do that, when things have been so unsuccessful? And any pushes you had before usually just lead to a lot of lives with very little ground. So, what do you do? It's like at this point, you're just seeking an armistice. I mean, we know that's a ways away. Or, do you still have the support? Do you still have the morale of the troops to do pushes like this?
For the summer of 1916, the Allies have planned major simultaneous offensives against the Central Powers, from east and west. Now they are needed more than ever to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago.
It looks like a big thing, right? You got like 3 fronts basically happening here.
Launch their attack
beginning
first.
Of the end?
On the Eastern Front, General Alexei Brusilov has carefully maintained the element of surprise. His troops break through the enemy lines, in some places advancing 60 miles and taking 200,000 prisoners. This brilliant, though costly, Russian attack achieves its aim, as the Central Powers are forced to redeploy troops from other fronts to shore up the line.
So I remember they talked about this in the earlier too, is people underestimate how large this front is. I mean, the Western Front is tiny compared to this Eastern Front, and the amount of troops you need and coordination to actually do an offensive. I mean, you're going through a whole continent. You know what I mean? As far as north to south goes, it's way harder to push over there. You would have to flank. I mean, it's the only way you can do it.
British cruiser HMS Hampshire, en route to Russia, hits a mine and sinks off Orkney. Among the 650 dead is Britain's iconic Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener.
That's big.
3 days later, in the Adriatic, Italian troopship Principe Umberto is sunk by a German submarine. It's the deadliest sinking of the war, with 1,900 lives lost. On the Western Front, Britain and France launched their major summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme.
Deadly.
Hopes are high for a breakthrough, but the first day is a disaster. A long Allied artillery bombardment fails to knock out German defenses.
Remember, they've now had 2 full years of defending. They are entrenched, both sides. This would have been needed a lot earlier in the war, but now you have 2 years of fortifications. That's possible.
And waves of British infantry are cut down by machine gun fire as they advance into no man's land. In the space of a few hours, the British suffer 57,000 casualties, a third of them killed. It's the worst day in the history of the British Army.
I mean, that is a morale killer. Get amped up. You know those generals and any kind of leaders had to prop up these soldiers who already are in terrible morale, who can barely hold on, let alone like mount an offensive. And then you get them to do it. They've bought in, right? And are probably promised a lot. Then you do this offensive, and it's a massive failure. Think of how morale would go even further. You would naturally lose respect for those that are in charge and think they're all crazy and have bad information and don't care about you. This is bad. This is why the longer the war goes on, the more morale is going to hurt, and you're going to get more deserters and less faith by not just the military, but also the public.
But more attacks are ordered, and the battle will rage for another 5 months.
Another late edition. You'd wonder at this time how anyone could even stay out of this, especially when you're in Europe. I mean, it's everywhere. How could you stay out?
By the Russian advance, Romania joins the Allies.
That's very helpful.
Despite an initially successful advance into Transylvania, Romania quickly faces a counter-offensive
Got to fight the
from
vampires,
German, Bulgarian,
the vampire
and
army.
Austro-Hungarian forces. The Allied force at Salonika tries to support Romania by launching their own offensive towards Monastir. With Serbian troops in the lead, there are small gains, but dogged Bulgarian resistance prevents a breakthrough. On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally calls off the attack at Verdun. The French army has honored their commander, General Nivelle's promise. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. But victory comes at a terrible price. 365,000 casualties. The Germans lose almost as many.
Oh my gosh.
Verdun.
Look at that! You have like over 700,000.
One of the bloodiest battles in human history.
For nothing, right?
For his defeat at Verdun, Falkenhayn is sacked, and Germany's heroes of the Eastern Front, von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, take command in the West.
Yeah, I mean, how could you not, with a failure like that and that many deaths, how could you not? You would have to replace that leader because there'd be no confidence in him. No confidence in him.
Meanwhile, the Battle of the Somme continues. Near the village of Flers, the British introduce a new weapon they hope can break the deadlock of the
Tanks?
trenches. It is called the tank.
Oh, look how crappy they are, though. Don't get too excited if you know about tank history. World War I tanks sucked. They are not what World War II tanks were. Look at that monstrosity. It's big, it's slow, it eats up gas. Remember, mass-produced automobile technology is also in its infancy, right? Just like planes we were talking about. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, they'll talk about it, but yeah, look at that. Doesn't look like the tanks you imagine in World War II, which were quicker and actually had some more offensive capabilities. But you got to remember, it's solving one of these issues, which every new technology was in World War I, was how can I do one of two things? How can I get out of my trench safely, and how can I get the enemy out of their trench? That's what all these technologies are about, right? Because machine guns started the whole thing of I can't move. So gas, that's a technology to try to get them out of your trench, right? Or out of their trench. And then a tank is how can I get out of my trench? Be able to get through no man's land, which also has barbed wire, which is another thing you can't cross. And you're getting just scoped out by, you got snipers, you've got, of course, the machine guns. So there you go. But interesting new entry, a new technology, armored vehicles.
But despite some small successes, the first tanks are too few in number and too prone to mechanical failure to make any real impact.
Imagine getting stuck in no man's land. With that, you're sitting in a coffin.
On the eastern front, Russia's Brusilov offensive comes to an end. Casualty estimates vary wildly, but it's clear both sides have suffered catastrophic losses. Neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army ever fully recovers.
1.4 and 1.
On the Italian front, heavy fighting rages throughout the autumn, as Italian forces make repeated, costly assaults against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme comes to an end amid autumn rain and mud. The Allies have advanced 10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties.
What's that stat again?
10 miles at the cost of 600,000 casualties.
600,000, over 500,000 for 10 miles, which is not even close to make any significant progress in this war. You'd think after Verdun, after the Somme, then out east with Austria-Hungary and Russia just piling up very somewhat similar numbers to each other. You'd think maybe at this moment, as 1916 is coming to a close, that you might be cool heads might prevail, although there are no cool heads probably at this time. It's time to make peace, right? Get the armistice going, reevaluate what the whole point of all this was. But it looks like it never happens, right? You think this would be the moment where it's like, this thing's obviously a stalemate.
German losses are about 450,000. The Allies reassure themselves that this is a winning strategy, because at this rate, Germany will run out of men first.
Now you can make a war of attrition.
Disaster engulfs Romania as the country is overrun by the Central Powers. Romanian forces suffer 250,000 casualties.
That's hard because Romania's, I don't know if you want to say they've had time to prepare because they were such a late entry that they would be getting put out this quickly. You'd think of having a lot of time to prepare. But
the remnants of its army take position alongside the Russians on the Eastern Front. That winter, Franz Joseph,
pushed out of their own
Emperor
country.
of Austria since 1848,
dude, look at those
dies.
chops.
He is succeeded by his son, Karl.
Would have been who? Franz Ferdinand?
In Britain, Prime Minister Herbert Asquith is forced from office and succeeded by David Lloyd George. While General
all the original
Joffre
leaders are gone,
is replaced as French Commander-in-Chief by General Nivelle, who promises victory through bold, aggressive action. Amid the comings and goings,
how could you promise that?
US President Woodrow Wilson's attempts to mediate a peace settlement come to nothing.
Nobody wants to
Neither
listen
side
to America.
is willing to make concessions. Epic History TV relies on the support of fellow history lovers. So if you like what we do, please consider pledging anything from $1 per video at the channel's Patreon page.
Cool. Such a great narrator. awesome. Yeah, join their Patreon. If you have a choice between my Patreon and their Patreon, go to theirs. What a great episode again. This seems to be the most devastating year of the war when you look at these battles, the famous ones, Somme, Verdun. And again, you'd think at this time maybe you would start listening to talks of peace, but the problem is it's like nobody within the conflict is wanting to talk about peace. It's outside the conflict. Like you have President Wilson, who would love to be an intermediary between this and will be a major mediary, at least he feels he is, at the end of the war. But that role changed, of course, for America because the year after this, year after that even, the United States is going to officially get involved. But yeah, you'd think with the amount of death happening here with no progress that you'd start to get ideas of people. You'd think in these governments, right? But you're still dealing with monarchies and things that still have a lot of power, but that you would have more calls for trying to get peace and that kind of thing. It shows you how committed, I guess, these nations still are in the face of bloodshed that none of these countries had ever seen before, and without anything to give them any kind of indication that this war is coming to an end, right? And you have new people in charge now, because obviously the people that have been in charge of this first 2 years should probably be fired, because none of the things they've done have worked, and all the promises they've made don't pan out. And the morale. I mean, I know 1917 is a big year for morale hits, and you could see how that's brewing here in 1916. You're running out of your army. You're starting to have to draft, again, more and more. You're going to have to start drafting people younger and younger, which is always an issue. You never want to have to draft. You don't have to, because a drafted soldier is not going to have as much training and things as a professional soldier. And like they were saying too, they understood that these countries, it's almost like it just comes down to, it is a war of attrition, meaning who can make it so literally these other nations don't have anyone to replenish dead troops, right? And that's such a scary and dark thing to kind of think about, right? Where it's just kill, 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 kill. And that's the only way you can win. Pretty crazy. So depressing time here, 1916. But yeah, we saw the introduction of the tank, which was good. Saw a lot more happening. So you had still more happening in Africa, and then in Europe. And you still see at this time like Russia's hanging in there, and actually done some decent things there. Although it looked like in the end here, they were starting to really mount up those casualties. You could see their front is so spread out. But 1917, as we know, is a big year because they're going to get revolutions going on in Russia. And you see the morale really starting to finally affect the war 3 years into it on all sides. But you're going to especially see that, of course, with Russia, because you're going to get the Russian revolutions in 1917. So anyway, I'm excited to keep on. We're past, I guess, the midway point now. So look out for the 1917 episode, which I'm assuming they have. And we'll try to get to that hopefully pretty soon. So I'm learning a ton. I hope you're learning a ton. I was able to add some context to you. That's what I try to do here, is not just react to how I think about things, but try to add something as well. Try to make it valuable that way, what I do. Okay. All right. And with that, we'll go ahead and start wrapping up. Links to stuff down below if you do want to join the Patreon and vote on the videos that get onto this channel. There's some cool history merch that we've got being sold, history-themed stuff. You go down to the Teespring store. Join our Discord community. We've got 7,000 people over there like to talk about stuff. If you're a gamer, check out my gaming channel. I play games and a lot of history kind of themed games over there too. And love to see you around and have you be a regular. All right, again, links down below. Make sure that to the original video, make sure you give that the views and all the support over there. Okay, and we'll see you next time. Bye.